Okay, so our next speaker I'll introduce is Bob Dobson, and he is president of the Irrigation Association. And let's get you to the right spot here. All right, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about irrigation systems and what we hopefully can do to mitigate some of these usage problems. And my discussion this morning is really going to be on maintenance and operation of systems and not so much on the design end. So to why is this not working?
All right. What did you use, Steve?
I was using the up and down arrow keys.
Okay.
That's what we're hitting.
No, it's not working.
There we go.
So maybe just click that side.
Okay. So when we look at landscape water use, there was a study that was done by the Environmental Protection Agency a number of years ago, and it estimated that about 1/3 of all residential water use is used by the landscape. When this study was performed, they actually analyzed irrigation systems, and they did this by auditing and looking at audits for about 4,000 irrigations systems throughout the United States. They estimated that a total of approximately 7 billion gallons of water are used per day, and in the landscape, the EPA study found out that 50% of that water is wasted, not needed to maintain a healthy landscape. So we're looking at some 3.5 billion gallons, that's billion with a B, of water that is wasted every single day in the summertime throughout the United States. Not only wasting water, but the landscape also does not benefit from this additional water. So how do we go about mitigating this? Well, we have our challenges because it is actually easier to schedule irrigation in Scottsdale, Arizona, or Las Vegas, Nevada, than it is in Manalapan, New Jersey, or Burlington County. This is summer rainfall patterns in New Jersey, and we're looking at the months of May through September, and you can see the variation in rainfall. We can take the month of August, and you can see that in 2010, in the month of August, we had just a little bit over 2 inches of rain. Now look at 2011. We had in excess of 17 inches of rain. So does our irrigation program need to adjust for these additional rainfall amounts? They certainly do. You can also look at the month of June, and where the differences are not that dramatic, we still have just barely 2 inches of rainfall in June in 2010. And when we look at 2009, we have in excess of 6 inches of rain. So if I was in Scottsdale, Arizona, I could install an irrigation system, develop a program, and almost not touch it year after year. The weather patterns are very, very consistent from one year to the other. This graph certainly shows this. You look down at the bottom, there's only one line. Well, why is that? Because there's absolutely no rain in Scottsdale, Arizona. That one little peak, on August 21st, 2010, Scottsdale, Arizona had 0.12 inches of precipitation. That was the total rainfall that occurred from the months of May through September during a 4-year period in Scottsdale, Arizona. So it makes irrigation scheduling there a heck of a lot simpler than it does here in the Northeast. Here is a graph that shows our 4-year monthly average temperatures, again for the irrigation period, which is really May through September. And again, we can see a dramatic variation in temperatures. We can look at 2009, and those of us that are irrigation contractors, we know that we had a very, very wet year that year. We also had cooler temperatures, and it certainly had an impact on our businesses. 2010, a much warmer period of time, and also creating a lot more activity out there for irrigation contractors. So the challenge is, how do we develop and implement an irrigation system that waters efficiently, particularly when we're looking at all of these variations in precipitation and in weather patterns? So what I would like to spend a couple of minutes doing is taking a look at actually what happens to the water from a sprinkler head after it leaves the sprinkler nozzle. There's a rather unique and different way of looking at what we're trying to achieve. First of all, we can have evaporation. So if we're irrigating in the full sun, we can lose up to 30% of the water that comes out of our systems to evaporation. Never gets down to where it's going to be beneficial to the plant. We can have puddling, and then it can evaporate. This is usually caused by applying water at a rate that the soil cannot absorb it above the soil's infiltration rate, or perhaps applying irrigation after the soil is already saturated. Dominic, your slide showing that tree that was already fully saturated. And my guess is that the homeowner, when it was starting to die, would simply put more water on it. So, it can overspray the intended target landscape. And here we have a spray head in a narrow strip. It throws a 12-foot radius. And unfortunately, this is a problem that is all too common in the state of New Jersey. We see an awful lot of our irrigation systems overspraying onto paved areas and unintended areas, really wasting all of the water that is applied in those particular areas. It can run off the target, the intended target. This is actually the White House lawn. A couple of administrations ago, and my family gets mad at me every time I go on vacation. I bring a camera, and if there's any sprinklers running, I'm snapping pictures. So obviously right here you can see that there's an awful lot of water that's running off the intended target. The irrigation program was certainly a lot longer and a lot heavier than what was required for the conditions. Then the water can actually infiltrate into the plant root zone. And then finally, it can percolate through the plant root zone, a process what we refer to as deep percolation, and it's going down into lower soil stratus where the plant root cannot reach. So when we look at all of these, all of the possibilities of what can happen with the water after it leaves the nozzles, of all these possibilities, there's really only one that is beneficial to the landscape or the turf, and that's infiltration into the plant root zone. And as contractors and irrigation system specialists and professionals, this really should be our goal, is to get the water that comes out of our irrigation systems down into the plant root zone. Getting the water used by our irrigation systems into the plant root zone, that should be our goal. And the higher the percentage of the applied water that enters that root zone, the more efficient our irrigation system and program is going to be. Now, let me also stress that we're going to look at trying to develop an efficient irrigation schedule. That really isn't possible if you have a poorly designed and installed irrigation system. In this particular slide, you can see the variation in the two pieces of property. The one property on the left there has pretty decent turf quality, uniform turf quality. Across the street, the home has very stressed turf areas. The programs in the two controllers are almost equal. They're very, very similar. The difference really is in the design of the two irrigation systems and the way that they were installed. So unfortunately, when we have a system that is really poorly designed or really poorly installed, developing an irrigation program in itself isn't going to remedy that problem. You need to be able to go in there and make some alterations to the system to improve the uniformity of coverage. So efficient irrigation scheduling requires a properly designed and installed system, a system that has a good distribution pattern. And you can see the two little graphs up there, the one on the right showing what we would consider to be high distribution uniformity, and the one on the left which would be low distribution uniformity. So let's look at the summer months, and it gets to be into July and August. What happens in the weak areas? Where we have weak areas, the lawns start to turn brown. So whoever is responsible for setting the dial, for going out there and making adjustments to the irrigation controller, what do? They crank that time up. And they keep cranking it up until the brown spot turns green. The problem is we've eliminated the brown spot, but as we've eliminated the brown spot, other areas that were getting sufficient water are now being grossly over-irrigated. So our challenge is not only in developing good programs, but making sure that we have systems that have good distribution uniformity. I've been in the industry for a long while. My company started in 1968, and I can remember going out on some of our first sales calls and meeting with homeowners and telling them, you know, we're going to put this irrigation system in, we're going to put a controller in your garage, you can set it and forget it. And maybe many of you are familiar with this infomercial, Ron Popeil, and that's what he would preach, set it and just forget it. Well, really, that philosophy, that type of mindset needs to be abandoned as irrigation professionals and irrigation managers. I'd like to say that if you've had to adjust the thermostat in your house, then you probably should go out and you should adjust your irrigation controller. This actually isn't a bad idea to put a little sticker by the thermostat in your homeowner's house, just reminding them that if they've had to turn the air conditioning on, maybe it's time to go make an adjustment to the irrigation system. And likewise, and probably even more importantly, when you've had to turn the air conditioner off, let's go back and let's back those programs off. Because really, the more frequent and accurate schedule adjustments you make, the programs will maintain a much healthier landscape, and it will do that on a minimal amount of irrigation and a minimal amount of water. So how much water do we need to apply to the landscape? Well, let's ask this guy, and you might remember this gentleman, E.T. And we're not talking about the movie star, no, we're talking about evapotranspiration, and that is really a combination of water that's transpired from vegetation. This is through the actual cooling of the plant material and through photosynthesis, and then also the water that's evaporated from the soil and the plant surfaces. And this is something that we can measure. This is something that we can determine. This is something that we have historical data on. So ET has a direct impact on how quickly stored water is depleted from the soil. The higher the ET rate, the quicker the moisture will be depleted. ET also has a direct impact on the health of our turf and our landscape. So it really is a measuring tool for how much water we need to apply. This slide sort of shows you the factors that impact ET. On the right-hand side, we have high humidity, we have a cloudy day, temperatures aren't too hot, and the wind is very, very still. So we have relatively low ET. On the other side, we have a day where we have full sun, warm temperatures, very low humidity, when that happens in New Jersey, not very often, and a nice breeze blowing. And these are factors that actually create relatively high ET. As a matter of fact, some of the highest ET rates that we have in New Jersey, surprisingly enough, are very often the end of April and early May. They're very short-lived, but what is unique about that time of year, every now and then we'll get a day when the humidity is down around 12 or 14%. We very rarely see those in the summertime. ET is an important player, and up until just recently, I mean, the last 6 months, it was very difficult to find out what the ET rate was anywhere in the state of New Jersey. There were some weather stations that were down in South Jersey with the South Jersey Resource and Conservation Development Council that were accessible. But other than that, if I wanted to know what the ET was in Freehold, New Jersey here, to use it as a guideline for scheduling, I would have a lot of difficulty. I want to show you a couple of websites here that are now available. Okay, this is actually the South Jersey Resource and Conservation Development Council. It has turned the operation of all of their weather stations over to Rutgers University. And working with the state climatologist, David Robinson, they now have an interactive map that is readily accessible. And this is actually showing us what the ET rate is today for various areas in New Jersey. So this can be used as a guideline for making irrigation scheduling decisions. Likewise, it used to be difficult to try to get any historical data. There was a book that was published by Toro that had some historical data from 1930 to 1961, and it was basically limited, when we looked at New Jersey, to 3 different areas. There was northern New Jersey, there was coastal New Jersey, and there was southern New Jersey. And what they really were the weather stations that were on our 3 major airports, being Newark Airport, Mercer County Airport, and Atlantic City Airport. But to try to get historic ET data for areas that were remote from there, it was virtually impossible to do so. This just happens to be one of the manufacturers of some of the smart controllers, and I believe several of the manufacturers have this available. On this particular website, you simply put a zip code in, and it comes up with the average daily ET rate for each month during the season. So again, another valuable tool that we never used to have at our access. I should put my glasses on. So as the soil dries out, what we really want to be able to do is to refill the plant available water or the plant root zone before the plant becomes stressed. Now, when we look at turf, turf has a built-in thermometer that tells us when it's in trouble. And that's really when it's no longer resilient, when we start to walk across the turf and we're leaving footprints and it doesn't spring back up. That's telling you better get out there pretty quickly and get some water on there, or you're going to have the turf go dormant. So plant available water, you could think of it as the plant's gas tank. And what we really want to do is we want to fill it up before it gets too close to empty. Keep trying to tell my wife she needs to fill the car up before it gets too close to empty. She loves that little thing that's on the dashboard now that tells you you've got 4 more miles to go before you run out of gas. This is what we're trying to avoid, because if we let this plant available water get too low, there's a good possibility that our turf or our landscape will go into stress. So that's a little bit of the background of what we are trying to do as far as irrigation scheduling goes. I'd like to also clear up a few misconceptions that I think we have that have been promoted throughout New Jersey for quite a few years. The first misconception is that lawns in New Jersey require 1 inch of water per week. You can find this pretty readily on a lot of different websites. And what I did here was I went in and I took the 30-year historical data, no precipitation, but I looked at what the ET rates were for the months of April through October. And you can clearly see here that applying 1 inch of water in April is applying way too much. In June and July, it's probably not going to be sufficient. And likewise, in October, it's going to be more than what's necessary. The only months that even resemble having a requirement of 1 inch per week are the months of May and the months of September. Sure, if you average all these out, you total all of the months and divide it by the number of months, guess what? It comes out to about 1 inch per week. But the fact is that in the early spring, we need far less than 1 inch of water per week. If we get into July, which is our peak ET month here in the state of New Jersey, if we've had little or no rainfall, then 1 inch of water per week is certainly not going to be enough. The second one, and I could get in trouble here, is that Water infrequently and deep to encourage deep rooting. Now, I'm a fan of doing that, but what we really need to take into consideration is looking at the seasonal growth pattern of cool season turf grass, which here in New Jersey, if we're growing anything other than zoysia grass, is a cool season turf grass. And as you can clearly see, as we go into the summer months, both the shoot growth and the root depth of the plant are less. The shoot growth is not as high, and the root depth comes up. Even with proper irrigation, the root depth is going to be shallower during the summer months. So all I'm suggesting is that the irrigation frequency may need to be increased in midsummer when we go into these stress periods and the roots are shallow. Other than that, irrigating deep and infrequently at other times of the year will certainly discourage shallow rooting and hopefully promote deep rooting. Misconception 3. I put this slide in here for you, Dominic. The plant's dying, it needs more water. And this is all way too common. In New Jersey, I think if you were to talk to landscape professionals, they would tell you that they probably lose more plant material due to overwatering than they do to underwatering. Misconception 4, rain sensors don't work. And I hear this from homeowners, I hear it from irrigation contractors. I like to compare them to a smoke detector in my home. A rain sensor needs to be checked the same way that the smoke detector needs to be checked and needs to be tested. And with many of our rain sensors, they're now battery powered, they're wireless. The battery needs to be checked and the battery needs to be replaced at regular intervals according to the manufacturer's recommendations. A number of years ago, I had the opportunity, Fred, to meet with Michelle Putnam. And Michelle told me in our meeting, she says, if I could have one irrigation regulation, it would be to require that every irrigation system in the state to be equipped with a rain sensor, and a requirement that that rain sensor would need to be tested at least once a year. So I think that Michelle, she really knows that they work. And what I would challenge all the irrigation contractors in here to do is, we have the ability to start to implement and make sure that our systems have these rain sensors in there. It's the responsible thing to do. So where are we? Well, we are March 25th, a snowy day in Freehold, New Jersey. This is a slide that shows the monthly precipitation for 2012. And the center line is the norm. Where you see red, that means that we had deficient moisture. Where we see green, you will see that we had excess moisture. And you can see that throughout 2012, most of our months we were at negative rainfalls, that we had less precipitation than the norm in the state of New Jersey. Likewise, if we take a look at the temperatures for 2012, and you'll see here that, so many of them are red and above the norm, including some record and some third warmest records, fourth warmest December. So, we're really at a point where last year we had a very, very dry year. No one knows exactly what we're going to have this year. And then we have June 29th, 2012.
We're probably in that picture somewhere.
So those of us in the irrigation industry, things were really starting to look up last spring. It was relatively dry, our backlog was going along, and we're thinking maybe we're actually going to get a pretty decent year, and then came June 29th, 2012. And rightfully so, mandatory watering restrictions. And as soon as the New Jersey American Water had the ability to do so, they lifted those restrictions. But what happened in the interim? Our nice warm weather patterns sort of disappeared, and we started to get prescription rainfalls about once a week. So the irrigation industry never really recovered. What I want to talk about the next couple of minutes is what can irrigation contractors do to help ensure there is adequate water for the upcoming landscape and irrigation season. Obviously, we're here because New Jersey American Water Company, the Department of Environmental Protection, the New Jersey Nursery and Landscape Association, the Irrigation Association in New Jersey, all want to be partners to help find ways to minimize the impact of irrigation on our water supplies. So here are some suggestions. Right off the bat, I would suggest that you program clients' irrigation systems to water on even and odd schedules. Some towns already have this as a mandate. Even number addresses on even days, odd number addresses on odd days. And so the people on even days don't get upset. No one waters on the 31st day of the month. Ensure that the run times are appropriate for the odd-even schedule. Now, if you were to talk with a lot of our regulatory community, we talk with people I know at the DEP, one of their concerns is every time they go to every other day watering schedule, the homeowner cranks the time up. So the end result is not a decrease, it's an increase in water consumption. So what I'm really trying to stress is let's look at this even odd watering schedule, but let's not increase the runtime solely because we're going to be watering on an even odd schedule. It is not necessary. Our challenge, not only is it for us the irrigation contractors to set initial programs, but then to be able to get the homeowners to maintain those settings. Looked at that slide that Steve had up there, and we looked at that one area where they were above their capacity. Well, you know, I leaned over to Fred and I said that was the 4th of July. And I can tell you most 4th of Julys, if we have warm weather, I would venture to guess it probably is your peak pumping capacity during the course of the year. So I'm suggesting that anything the irrigation industry can do right off the outset with pre-planning to help to minimize the impact of that, you know, let's try to go ahead and do it. So if there's a way that you can inform your customer, if you can program your controller, some of our controllers have the ability to program certain days. So perhaps we don't irrigate July 4th. Perhaps we don't irrigate the Saturday and Sunday before or after July 4th. But I do think that those would have a real impact on minimizing the amount of water that's used by irrigation at those peak periods. Make sure every system you maintain has a working rain sensors. These devices should be tested at the start of the season. They really should be in a location that they get rainfall from all different directions. I'm appalled at when I go out and I see a rain sensor strapped up against the side of a building where unless the rain's coming out of the northeast, it's never going to get a drop of precipitation. So if they're in a bad location, look at relocating them. Change the batteries when required. And there have been a lot of advances in rain sensors. There is a rain sensor on the market that will shut off the irrigation system almost on the first drop of rain. I really think that this is something that is beneficial for particularly our commercial clients. The discussion of the bank watering in the rain. You know, let's put something in there, as soon as it starts to rain, it's going to shut it off. There are also programmable sensors, and what that does is when a certain measured amount of precipitation has fallen, it will shut the irrigation off for 2 days or 3 days, regardless of whether or not the moisture evaporates from the rain sensor. So these are state-of-the-art new tools that we have that can help to promote further water conservation. This is something I hope we all do, a thorough check of the system at the startup, looking for piping breaks or leaks or restricted or crushed piping. Check sprinkler heads, make sure that they're set to grade and plumb, not pump, plumb, P-L-U, okay. Are operating at correct pressure, have the appropriate nozzle sizes. This is an area I also find very often is overlooked, that we have a sprinkler head that's broken and perhaps we don't have the appropriate one, so we just grab what might be in our toolbox and we put it on there. It has a very dramatic impact on the system uniformity. So change the sprinkler heads with heads that have appropriate nozzles. And are they adjusted properly and not overthrowing onto paved and other unwanted areas? Heard a little bit about smart technology, and I am a big proponent of smart technology. Upgrade the irrigation controller to a smart controller Or if you can't do that, try to develop another method for making schedule changes during the season. So smart controllers, many of them now, if you've bought a toilet or a shower head recently, many of them you'll see have a WaterSense label on it. Well, just about 6 months ago, WaterSense started labeling the first smart controllers. So we now have a large number of controllers that carry the WaterSense label, and they can be found on the WaterSense website. Smart controllers operate on 3 premises. When they first came out, they were pretty expensive. The simplest simply make adjustments to what we call the seasonal adjust or water budget feature on our controller. But in order for them to work properly, they must have an accurate base program installed. So this is a simple, this happens to be a Hunter one. It's a solar sink. I happen to have quite a few of these in on some of our residential clients, and what the 80% window shows you is at this point in time, it is only irrigating at 80% of what the schedule is. I will tell you that in the 3 or 4 years that we have put these in, I don't know if I've ever seen one of them that has been irrigating at 100% of the schedule. So that means that every single time I've looked at that, that controller is using less water and actually applying a more appropriate amount to the landscape. So again, this depends on the entry of a good base irrigation program. Garbage in, garbage out, I like to say. The second type requires accurate, detailed data entry of soil-water plant relationship, irrigation information, and then it really builds the program on that input. You don't tell the controller when to start, how long to run. It makes these projections based on the information that you put in. So it's plant type, soil type, root depth, exposure, slope, microclimate, water window, sprinkler type, precipitation rate. And then once this data is installed in there, the controller, based on what the ET rate is, it makes a decision on how long it waters. Mr. Barrett, who's sitting in the back of the room here, we have one of these controllers in his residence. And I call him from time to time and I ask him, I said, how's your lawn look? And he says, it looks great. And I ask, have you seen the irrigation system run? He said, well, I think it ran last Thursday because the edge of my driveway was wet. So the technology really does work. So these develop programs based on soil, water, plant conditions. Again, it's imperative that good information be put in there. And then finally, the last type of smart controller actually measures the soil moisture and prevents irrigation when there's sufficient moisture present. Maybe this is a little simpler approach. What's ET trying to do? It's trying to figure out what the climate conditions are doing to the soil moisture. So if we can accurately measure the soil moisture, we don't really care what the ET rate is. There, again, are a variety of these that are on the market. They need to be installed in the plant root zone. They need to be installed in an area that's hit by irrigation. Multiple sensors very often are required for different types of areas, plant types with different watering requirements, different soil types, different exposures. So to accurately control this, we may have 3 or 4 sensors on one property. They should be put in the driest location of the area that the sensor controls. If we put it in a spot that stays abnormally wet, it's going to think that the soil moisture is good and it's going to prevent irrigation. So does this technology work? Here's a slide. This is showing a 3-year period. The red line is the evapotranspiration rate. The blue line is the actual amount of irrigation that has been applied. So you see in all instances, the irrigation is only a percentage of what the actual ET rate was. Now here's what's interesting. If we take a look at what we would have programmed normally if we were to set a controller like they may be set today, 30 minutes per station watering every other day, those dotted lines show you what the water application would be. So everything between the red and blue lines below that dotted line would have been wasted water. So it's a substantial amount of water. Here's a little slide that is showing a moisture sensor. And what we have here is each one of these spots here, the moisture sensor is a threshold that it reaches when it's too dry, and it goes ahead and it turns the irrigation system on, and you can see at that point that it irrigates back up to an acceptable level. Now, what's interesting here, you can see that during this month of October, the irrigation system ran 3 times. If we had scheduled it like we very well might, watering 3 days a week, this is the number of irrigation cycles we would have had. We would have had 7 irrigation cycles that month. So again, really good historical data on what smart technology can do. So smart technology requires a higher skill set and knowledge level. And if we don't have this, again, if we're not putting good, valuable information in, we are not going to get good results out. So we need to have an understanding of soil-water plant relationship. We should have a basic knowledge of various plant material water requirements. Certain plants do not tolerate a lot of moisture, a lot of irrigation. Others require it. We need to have the ability to know and calculate how fast our irrigation equipment is applying water to the landscape. Okay? Input of accurate information will result in the generation of inaccurate information will result in the generation of an unsuitable irrigation program, one that could potentially even waste more water rather than conserve it. Garbage in, garbage out. If you feel like there's a need to have additional training in these areas, the Irrigation Association of New Jersey each February sponsors classes. There's also online training available at the Irrigation Association. And this is an online training class that you could take at your own pace. Again, if we don't put valuable, good, solid information in, we're not going to get a good schedule out. So it's probably a good chance that a lot of our clients out there aren't going to necessarily accept the smart technology. So does that mean that we can't improve the way that they're irrigating? So what it really boils down to is the more frequent the schedule adjustments are made, the more water efficient the schedule will be, and the less water or less irrigation will be needed. So there are some ways that we can look at this. We can look at, as a contractor, initiating this. One way to do this is schedule regular site visits. Perhaps if you have a planned residential community, you make adjustments once a week. You go out there and make those adjustments. However, in today's technology, we have a lot of other options. We have possibility of being able to maintain these systems by modem connections or by cloud-based systems, where we can actually adjust these controllers from our office. We don't need to go out to the residence or to the site. We also have technology of ways to communicate with the client. So the second one would be consumer initiated. And when we look at consumer initiated, what I really would suggest is almost all of our controllers today have what we call a season adjuster water budget feature. And this is simply a dial that or a bar that we slide one way or the other, or maybe a screen that we push a button and the percent goes up or down, but it adjusts the existing schedule by a percentage point. So we can irrigate at 70% of our program, we can irrigate at 150% of our program. We're not going in and changing all the times on all of the different stations. I find this a very easy concept to sell to the homeowner, to the consumer. I actually wish the controllers were locked and all they had was this one little slide bar that they could touch. So there's a couple of ways that we can communicate this. Again, we can communicate this based on contractor communication. Perhaps one of the things that you do, if you have a website, you could post it on your website. If you have a blog, you could put it on your blog. Perhaps you may use Constant Contact. Once a week on a Monday, you have an email address of your clients, and you email your clients saying, hey, this week you ought to be irrigating at 80% of what your schedule is. So there are options there. Postcards, that's sort of antiquated technology in today. But these are some options that allow for numerous and hopefully even weekly adjustments to the irrigation control system. Now, if your client base is such that they're not going to be acceptable to that, we have another option. and that's to develop an irrigation schedule that's based on our historical ET data. So for instance, we would take a look at the seasonal adjustment or the water budget feature. You can see down here that it's set at 100%. And what I really recommend is looking at developing an irrigation schedule with a net application of 1 inch per week. You're probably saying, well, Bob, you told us that 1 inch per week isn't appropriate. Well, this is going to be our base schedule. 1 inch per week, and really for areas that are in the full sun. So if you have an area that's less than full sun, you're going to derate that schedule a little bit. It's not going to water quite as heavily. And then make the adjustments for those wet areas, those shady areas that require less water. And then provide your client with a recommended setting to the season adjusted water budget that's based on the 30-year historical average. Now, this is probably really less than ideal. I mean, what we have to do is to go back to that graph and we look at the precipitation rates and the temperatures in the state of New Jersey the last couple of years. But at least this is something. And for those clients that may not be acceptable to other alternatives, giving them this little thing and saying, hey, you know what, we're going to set this up. We're going to turn your system on in April. We're going to irrigate at 50%. Come May 1st, you want to bump that up to 80. And what's even more importantly is that when you get through July, now all of a sudden we don't need as much irrigation, that they start to adjust them the other way. Historically, what happens is the lawn turns brown and the client or the homeowner goes out and it cranks the system up, and then it gets cooler, and they don't do anything until they get the water bill. And then they call Steve.
Yes.
It's got to be a leak in my system. I could not have used this much water. Am I right? So I think using that water budget feature is really a simple way of conveying to our homeowner, to our consumer. I'd like to finish up by talking about a couple of underutilized control features that I think can really help promote water conservation. And many of our controllers have what we call cycle and soak features, and we'll very often use these if we have a very, very heavy clay soil. But in reality, they will actually usually benefit the landscape in almost all applications. So if you're going to set your controller for, say, rotary heads for 30 minutes, break it into 2 cycles of 15 minutes. Actually, the plant will benefit more from the water applied than if it was all put down at one time. And it's a simple setting on most of our controllers. This is another improvement, and it's a pet peeve of mine, and unfortunately it's all too common in the way our systems are designed. We have rotary heads along the sidewalk, and we're overthrowing the sidewalk. Yes, there's an additional cost involved if we were to try to irrigate these parkway strips, these narrow strips, but how much water is wasted overthrowing the sidewalk? And I've done some analysis. I've looked at dollar-wise, and Steve, your water's cheap, so it's not really a lot of dollars. I've looked at the gallons, and the gallons of water is all relevant to what the client is thinking. But here's something that you may think about. In the summer months, the water that's wasted each week during that summer overthrowing that sidewalk, the water that throws on that sidewalk, a family of 5 could take a shower every single day of the week with that water that's wasted on that sidewalk. I think that puts it in terms that the consumer can relate with. So if it's going to cost a couple extra bucks, a couple extra dollars to irrigate that parkway strip separately, perhaps that will be enough motivation to get them to invest in a more efficient, better designed systems. How important is scheduling? Well, in many areas of the country, there are irrigation companies, irrigation professionals. They don't turn irrigation systems on, they don't turn them off, they don't install them. All they do is maintain the schedules on there. Maybe someday we will progress to that here in the Northeast, but it certainly is becoming far more important for us. Water shortages and regulations will require full-time management of our irrigation systems. That's really why we're in this room today. The set it and forget it mentality of irrigation management philosophy is no longer viable, so we really, really need to change. efficient irrigation scheduling, it really is the responsible way to irrigate. It's the way that we should all be programming our controllers, and it will result in lower water usage. I also think in the current environment we're in, it will also help us to work with our partner, New Jersey American Water Company, to try to minimize the impact that we could have due to short supply and due to infrastructure repairs that are still underway. So thank you very much, and with that, I think I'll turn it back to Christine.